Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me this evening for Operation Safe Spaces celebration of International Women's Day. Of course, International Women's Day is observed every March the 8th around the world. And the theme for the day for this year is Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. I guess when you've been doing the work that I've been doing for as long as I've been doing it, sometimes it feels like if you're not making any progress or not making enough progress. But yet we take this time every year and we want to think about, how we continue to do that work. And I'm very happy that the theme this year encompasses the idea of sustainability. And many people are reading that sustainability as environmental sustainability. But I think really that sustainability has a lot to do with how we as women continue to navigate and negotiate our lives, just living as women, which comes with its own challenges and its own set of issues. I'm very happy this evening to introduce to you Luke Daniel, who we will have a conversation with in this activity. Unfortunately, we were supposed to have two guests, as you know from our flyer. One of our guests was not able to make it today, and so we are going to send our good thoughts over her way, but we're also going to keep this show going. So on behalf of my co-director, Robin Paris, and the management team at Operation Safe Space, we're very happy to welcome, as I said, Luke Daniels. He's a social activist, counselor, and consultant on domestic violence. He was born in Guyana and has resided in the UK since the 1970s. His pioneering work with perpetrators of domestic violence at the Everyman Centre in London received national recognition in a 1992 documentary. He's the author of Pulling the Punches, Defeating Domestic Violence, and Defeating Domestic Violence in the Americas, Men's Work. I'm very happy, Luke, to welcome you and that you could find the time to sit with us and have this conversation. Welcome.
Well, thank you for the introduction. The honor is all mine. I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and it's the first time I've actually been invited to speak on International Women's Day. So I feel especially privileged to be in this position. And I must say a big thank you to you and Robin for the contact we've had and for making this happen.
Thank you.
In some ways, you're ahead of the curve, I must say, because I think one of the things that's been lacking in terms of working with domestic violence is the involvement of men. But I think, finally activists and campaigners are beginning to wake up to the fact that, there's no ending of domestic violence unless men are involved in some way. We're the main perpetrators of domestic violence and we need to be involved. So I thank you for inviting me to be in this session today.
Thank you so much. And I mean, that makes Robin and I warm, we must tell you. We did a training for advocates who work and support women last October. And around the room of advocates at that time, I think one of the main questions was, how do we get through to men? How do we build, collaborative work with men? And so it is something that Robin and I have definitely come away with. And it is something that, the universe is very interesting because between Robin and I, we are the mothers of 5 boys. And so I guess even in our own day to day, we're like, okay, we need to think about how we talk to our boys and how we ask them to hold our hands in support of the work that we are doing. So it's definitely a theme in the work as we're doing it right now. So tell me a little bit about your journey, Luke. What has brought you to be a social activist in the domestic violence space?
Well, it happened in a way that I never imagined. I was married for 10 years, and I actually slapped my wife, and as a result, I suffered so much dissonance, as it were, because it's something I promised myself I would never do, something my dad had instilled in us as boys, that come on, men who hit women, are cowards, basically. So when I did it, I was very depressed for about 3 months, and I actually decided to get some counseling. As a result of that counseling, I realized that one of the reasons why I did hit my wife was the socialization for violence that I had received in many ways, the sexism that was operating. And I made a decision then that I would always interrupt domestic violence if I see it happening. Of course, at that time, I was just thinking about physically getting in the way, stopping it in that kind of physical manner. Because, in some ways, that was my socialization. I thought, well, I would use it in a positive way, because, I'd been involved in lots of fights. It was something that was part of my growing up. I grew up in one of the roughest, toughest villages in Guyana you can think about, and you had to learn to fight to defend yourself. So I thought I would use that experience to interrupt domestic violence in that kind of way, or any violence to women. And then later on, I trained as a counselor, and when an opportunity opened up at the Everyman Centre for a black man, is what it wanted, because Brixton is a predominantly black area in London. And so, the guys who were starting this project felt they needed a black counselor to work there. And that's how I really got pulled into the work and started doing it.
Tell me a little bit more about the Everyman Centre and the work that you did there.
Well, when I started, I worked there for 5 years, and we folded as a result of lack of funding. But we were actually the largest centre in the UK at the time, working with perpetrators. At the beginning, we struggled to get men to the project because we only accepted men who self-referred. We thought it was important that men actually took that responsibility to say, hey, I need a hand, I need help, and they would approach us. But it meant that few men were actually coming to us. And as a matter of fact, most of the men that came to us was a result of some woman finding out about the Everyman Centre and saying, hey, go and do something about your violence, or I'm out of here. So although they came voluntarily, there was a little push happening in many instances. Now, we run a program of 6 months, basically, and 3 months of that was working with the men individually on a one-to-one basis, and then doing group work with them, kind of awareness, learning skills sessions. And that was different from the other organizations around. There was another organization just starting up, which were actually just receiving men from court-mandated services. So if they'd gone to court, they would say, you got to go and get counseling. And so they received government funding and so on. And here, their approach was to just do educational work, as it were. They just did group work. They did no one-to-one work. Most of the counselors at the Everyman Centre, we had 3 different approaches happening. One was a CAT, cognitive analytical therapy, trained, and he worked in that way. We had a psychotherapist. I trained in co-counseling. So we had 3 different approaches to working with the men. In some ways, my work became the most prominent in the sense of the project you talked, the TV program that you mentioned, because we were approached after about a year into the work to make a program, and I argued for it. Some men were a bit suspicious that maybe this television company just wants to put us in a bad light and so on, but I thought we needed that publicity to get men through the door. So I argued that we should actually agree to make the program. But it fell upon me because at the time I was running the only group. And so the program was really made about me doing my work with men individually and in group work. It was a huge success because we had over 500 calls from men on the night asking for help. We had some women calling as well. And I think it really set off men's work in the UK generally. Our books were full for years after that, and we never struggled again to get a men through the door.
That is awesome. And I'm asking you about it because I think we're very much in the place in Barbados and the Caribbean where we're looking for models to do this kind of work. And, I guess it's always, some kind of human inclination to feel like you're the first or you're doing something that is new. But I think it is important for individuals like you, and especially because you have the experience of being a Caribbean man, of being a Black man. So it's not necessarily that we're taking a model that is foreign, but we're just taking the work of an individual who's among us and of us, and bringing it from the space of the UK into the Caribbean. You've done work in Africa as well. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we have that context really, it needs a Black man really to be working with Black men. We understand each other in that kind of way, these cultural things. The work in South Africa, is one of the places that I feel so privileged to have visited in a sense, because also it was the first place that I was invited to speak at a conference on domestic violence. And the title they had for it was called Men as Part of the Solution. And it's some way in which I feel that Black women get it. You've got to involve men in getting this work done. This was at a time when we were actually facing opposition from many white women groups in the UK in terms of our works, being challenged about the work we were doing. We were seen as competition for them getting funding and so on. And so those kind of issues were playing out. So being invited to speak somewhere was really refreshing for me. I went over. After that session, they decided they wanted to do something more. So they asked me to return to help to train some young men to set up a project. And I returned and trained about 16 young men over a 3-month period. Very intense counseling training for them. Some of those men have gone on to set up projects and are still doing good work in South Africa. And for me, it was it gave me the idea when I was there to actually write a book when I realized the magnitude of the problem that we actually face and the size of South Africa. It was almost impossible to make any impact by training 60 men, maybe doing a project in Johannesburg or neighboring. And you've got this massive country with a huge problem. South Africa at the time was one of the most violent places for women. 4 women were killed. A woman was killed every 4 hours in South Africa at the time. You hear some of the most horrific accounts of abuse. So I fell on the idea of actually writing a self-help book. And that's how come I wrote Pulling the Punches as a self-help book, thinking that, well, I could reach men who are in remote areas who wouldn't be able to see a counselor or get to a project. So that was, it was very inspiring. And
Thank
some
you
good
so much.
stories came out of that as well, because one of the things that happened when I was there, a TV company also approached me to help with the making of a program on domestic violence, and it was called Soul City. And the main actor in that film, it turned out he was actually a perpetrator. So they then came back to me to say, would I counsel him? And I spent a few sessions counseling this actor who, when I returned the next year, was quick to come around to me to really feel so proud to tell me he's now an advocate against violence to women, and he's being used in his position and his fame to actually publicize domestic violence. Sadly, he died last year. Patrick Shaw, he died last year. So we lost a good advocate. My work with the perpetrators, I really work with them in a sense to raise their awareness to the level that most of them become advocates. Even the men in the group in London, during the group work, they would come back and say, I intervened. I spoke to this guy. I interrupted something. And I think it's important that there be a radical approach to working with perpetrators.
And that brings us so nicely into talking now, Luke, about the Caribbean, because I have said it to you and I have said it all the time. It feels to me like Caribbean men are resolute on being stuck in the past. And I know most about Barbadian men. And so I probably should even qualify that some more to say, it feels like if my Barbadian brothers are resolute on being stuck in the past, what are your reflections of the Caribbean man in 2022? What do we need to do to be able to deal with the scourge of domestic violence in the Caribbean?
Yeah, well, I think there's two important things we need to just afraid is that the Caribbean man really is a product of slavery and colonialism. And those two have been very devastating on whole communities. And we will talk a little bit more about that hopefully along in the program. But I think those two have impacted hugely on us, especially in the Caribbean. We've grown up with the notion that man's home is his castle, which we've, got from Britain. So men have got this notion that anything they do in the home is okay. The sexism is rampant. And that was encouraged in some ways by the whole colonial system that women were there as sexual objects to be used and abused, as it were. There was little protection for women. So men actually feel as though, well, the law, and everybody agrees with this notion that somehow women are lesser than men. So sexism and the whole experience of slavery are two things that impact on the way Caribbean men behave. My second book I wrote actually was as a result of the Caribbean and the Americas being designated as one of the worst places for a woman to be. Domestic violence is rife. Lots of the countries in a lot of the islands are in the red bracket of domestic violence in terms of the small population and the violence that is happening. So we need to address those problems.
If you're now joining us, I am interviewing Luke Daniels. He is a social activist, counselor, and consultant on domestic violence. Luke was born in Guyana and he has resided in the UK since the 1970s, pardon me. His pioneering work with perpetrators of domestic violence at the Everyman Centre in London received national recognition in a 1992 documentary. He's the author of two books, Pulling the Punches, Defeating Domestic Violence, and Defeating Domestic Violence in the Americas, Men's Work. Now, Luke, in terms of, I want to talk a little bit about the pattern of abuse, because this is the work, I think, when we're talking about gender equality, when we're talking about sustainable tomorrows, I think there's a lot of investment that is necessary in education. And I think sometimes the message gets lost because it is constantly women bringing the message. And I accept, and I'm always happy for men like you, who I recognize as safe advocates. I want to talk especially about the what we call parental alienation and what that looks like in the context of abusive relationships. Now, I am not talking about relationships that end where men and women are self-regulating and can move themselves to a co-parenting phase. I'm talking specifically about where there is abuse as a function or a feature of the relationship. I want you to explain a little bit because it's a hot topic in Barbados at the moment. And the feeling is basically that women are trying to stop men from seeing their children. As an advocate who's worked in the UK, who's worked in Africa, who's worked around domestic violence, I would like you to talk to us a little bit about how we keep women protected, but also navigate co-parenting if we have to.
Yes, I think it's an area that needs, good attention. Fortunately, I actually worked in that field in a way in the UK here, working with one borough, which actually facilitated the meetings of women and the perpetrator when there's children involved. What the law has done is to make sure that the men had access to seeing the children, but it had to be in a supervised kind of way. So they come to the center, they meet there, and they could have access to children to spend time, depending on the level of violence, of course, that is gone on, and how the legal situation was. So I think one is it needs some kinds of supervised way in which contact with perpetrators can be made with the children. Now, with the men, I think, women face a particular problem in the Caribbean, not only in the Caribbean, but all over the world. This happens, is that men actually tend to use children as a way of actually getting at the women. They stay in their lives and still try to control their lives in a kind of way. So perpetrators still try to have some control over that woman, although the relationship might have ended, and because there are children there. But I do feel it's important that those men and those children have contact with the father, but needs to be some work done with the father. And I think this is where a project for working with the perpetrators, working with the men, so that their consciousness could be raised, so they can get the information and get some skill at doing that. A big part of my work was well, one of the topics on my program is I call it parenting for change, and this was encouraging fathers to learn about good parenting skills, and also no smacking was a important part for me. But we might come back to some of the causes for domestic violence.
Of course. Thank you very much for that. Before I open the floor, because we are getting questions coming in from the audience, but I wanted to ask you one more question just before I open the floor. In your hometown of Guyana, the only thing that I can call it is the little comment. What is happening, Luke? I expect this behavior from men in Barbados, but not Guyanese men. What happened with the little comment? What was that?
I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. But in some ways, it just shows the level of awareness for men about sexism and so on, that somebody could actually get into the position of being a parliamentarian and be at such a low level of discourse with women. I mean, it's just shameful, for me as a Guyanese to think that a parliamentarian would, abuse an opposition woman by telling her she needed to get a dildo. It's just outrageous, and that she not be censored by the speaker or not defended by anybody in the house at the time, men or women. Just for me shows a level of lack of awareness around sexism and about men's abuse of women, because this was very abusive, and that should never have happened. But it reflects the whole political atmosphere of the whole Caribbean, I think, because we're doing a lot of politics throughout the Caribbean. And I'm surprised at how many men who I regard as being intelligent, bright, who've never, some have said they've never read a book by a woman, written by a woman. So I don't know where the level of awareness would be. And I like to, I mentioned before we started speaking about Angela Davis, and why she's important for me is because when I was in Guyana at the time of the Black Power movement, the government at the time was actually critical of the Black Power movement. We don't need that in the Caribbean because, we've got power, so we don't need Black Power in the Caribbean, as it were. Mm-hmm. And when Angela Davis was actually listed as one of the top 10 most wanted people in America, and I saw the picture of Angela Davis, I thought, what, this beautiful woman is no way, she can be this terrible person they're talking about. And so I started reading some more into the politics, into the story about the Black Power movement, and eventually read Angela Davis's Women, Race and Class, and was fortunate to meet her a couple of times. And for me, one of my absolute heroines. So when even political men don't read an informative book like Women, Race and Class, which I feel every man should have a copy. As a matter of fact, I'm never without a copy of it. Mm-hmm. I think it just reflects really badly on the men in the Caribbean who have gone through university and in higher education have never read women or don't feel it's important enough to do that.
And I think as we're talking about sustainable tomorrows, that point that you're making is a profound point, because I have also said many times, and will continue to say until somebody hears, a big part of the problem that we have in the women's movement in the Caribbean is that we're being led by misogynist men. And we go out every 5 years and we vote for these men. We don't have many expectations outside of them becoming, the men that we admire on TV for their speeches and that kind of thing. but it means nothing in our daily lives. And so, you know, yes, when you talk about that, it definitely resonates with me. I'm going to open the floor. I hope that our participants are not shy. I'm sure you have questions for Luke based on his experience and based on what he's shared. I know somebody has been asking Luke how they get access to your books. So maybe we can start with that, and hopefully other people will put their hands up. So how do we get a hold of your books?
Well, you can get it directly from my organization, Caribbean Labor Solidarity. I'll give you the website number. We sell books on there, and it's cls-uk-org-uk.
Thank you so much. And of course, I will let you repeat that. Go ahead.
Yes, they might be able to get also from the publisher. Hansip is one of the publishers, and the other publishers, Bogle Overture. Hansip Publishers in the UK.
Thank you very much for that. As we continue, I will, of course, allow you to share that information some more. The names of the books, Luke's books, Pulling the Punches, Defeating Domestic Violence, and Defeating Domestic Violence in the Americas, Men's Work. Any other questions in the chat at this time, or do I have the pleasure of continuing to pick Luke's brain myself? Any questions? You can just go ahead and raise your hand, and we can pick it up that way, or you can type in the chat. All right, while the audience warms up a little more, Luke, I wanted to talk a little bit about emotional intelligence. So I think that one of the relics of coloniality, as you have said to us, you know, it has had a severe impact on us as women and men. And I think families, you know, the way we rear children, or our entire existence as Caribbean people. And one of the things that we are very unconscious about, I think, is the way in which we emotionally abuse each other. And I'm not even just starting at intimate relationships, right? I'm just talking about the way we talk to each other in the street, come up back from that. So in terms of emotional intelligence and in terms of breaking, you know, our colonial pattern, tell us some of the experiences that your work, some of the lessons that your work has thrown up.
Okay. The intelligence, I think awareness, the whole impact of emotional intelligence, you know, it's really crucial that we get to think about people, you know. I think the way we learned that was, well, you know, walk in somebody's shoes, you know, you just think, well, if you do something to someone, you know, how would you feel, you know, about it? And many of us sometimes don't reflect on that. And because that teaching often is not there at any part or at any level really of our development in the Caribbean, whether in schools or in the home. And many of us get hit as children. So sometimes the things that we learn from home is actually that using violence is okay. You know, some of the research I've looked at in terms of the impact of education on domestic violence is that it can make a huge difference. Less educated men tend to revert to using violence more than men who've had some level of education. And that's been reflected in many studies. So they've actually said that, you know, getting an education is important. Of course, there's education. We need to get emotional education as well, and we need to learn about those things. And so just learning really that using violence is not acceptable. But because we get hit as children, most times we accept it. You know, one of the stories I've put in my first book is, you know, one of the perpetrators actually talking about what a brilliant childhood he had, growing up in Jamaica on a farm. And in a few seconds after, he's mentioned being his dad breaking a branch of a tree to whip him because he had a ride on the pig. he was riding a pig, and he reckoned, it was okay because his dad had warned him. And this was a man who was there, who I was counseling, because he had told his partner, not to do something, and she done it, so he feels it's okay to hit her. So the way in which the way we get parented often impacts on the way we behave. And one of the things I think could make a huge difference in the Caribbean is if we can move away from this notion that it's okay to hit children, that smacking children is okay. So,
definitely. And interestingly, I know that there are a lot of men's groups in Barbados who have been the staunchest defenders of corporal punishment. So that's interesting. It's interesting because of, like you say, the connection between that type of physical abuse in childhood and teenage years, and the connection to perpetrating in other stages of life. There's another question in our chat. It says, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say a little bit more on that. And that's because also one of the things that's happened, our experience in the Caribbean has been one of slavery, and it's been one of the most brutalizing experiences that any nation could have. We've had it for over 300 years. Our great-grandparents, many of them would have been probably the children of a slave. Most of those slaves would have been brutalized, and most of that brutalization was with weapons. Whether in the seasoning process as they did it as new slaves came to the islands, or whether it was as a way of punishment throughout the existence. As a result, I think at the end of slavery, many of the enslaved would have been suffering from post-traumatic stress. And I think maybe we'll talk a little bit about that around the mental health issue that might have been raised later in the discussion. So I'll leave it there, but I think those experiences have impacted on us as well.
All right. We have another question in the chat. It reads, what would you say to those men who are staunchly holding on to traditional gender norms?
Yes, that is a real problem. I think at the root of domestic violence, it's patriarchy. I haven't mentioned my new book, which is being edited at the moment, and I'll be looking to have published this year, which I've had to look in more deeply into patriarchy and how that has shaped our countries. Almost every country in the world is, patriarchy rules. And so most men have got this idea that they should be in charge of women, that they are better than, and it's come down throughout history. It's deeply embedded in most men that somehow, we're the leaders, we should be in charge of women, and men take advantage of women as a result of that. And we must remember that, even like in the UK, of just over 100 years ago, it was legal for a man to beat his wife with a stick, providing it was no thicker than his thumb. So when you have the state supporting violence to women, men then feel they've got the okay to go out and abuse women. When you've got services that don't react in a way that it's a crime, and even in the UK, as recently, the police would come to a domestic violence situation and report it as only a domestic, and sometimes not taking further action. Things have changed a little bit, and it's getting a little bit better, but still, we see that the police force is not being responsive enough in a way that is supportive of women. So men at every level are affected with the notion that men should be in charge. So even those that are supposed to be protecting women, including governments who the UN say, have a responsibility to see that women are safe, are not doing enough to make sure that women are safe. And I must congratulate you on the name for your organization, Operation Safe Space. I think that's really great. Women need a safe space to be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I mean, you're just, it's like, I just want to shut up and not interview and just listen, because you're touching so many of the things that Robin and I think are critical in being able to really deal with this problem. The unresolved, outstanding overlooked, underlooked issue of mental health in the Caribbean. Talk us through a little bit about what your experience has shown you is the connection between mental health and perpetration of domestic violence.
I mean, I actually used to work in the mental health field, and so I know that many men who've been hurt and abused, end up with mental health issues. They become perpetrators. For the women who've been abused by men, they suffer as a result. And if they're parenting children, a lot of that, is passed on. If I may, I'll actually mention, my our own personal story, because I think sometimes we need to make these things personal. One of my sisters, I think as a result of domestic violence, I wasn't in the country at the time, but I think it's probably what triggered it, ended up in the mental health system. And in some ways, is still in the mental health system. As a result of her condition, she was not able to parent her children in the best way. Some of them did remarkably well considering. But, I think one is not benefit or has been really damaged by the whole experience of not having a mother being there fully for her, and of course, an absent father. And so it impacts greatly on family. As a result, she as well has had real problems with her own children in terms of safeguarding them, so on. And it's led to just some horrific situations that it won't be fair for me to go into them deeply here. Mm-hmm. But yes, mental health is a serious problem, within the Caribbean and within the issue of perpetrators. And as I alluded earlier on, I think the whole experience of slavery, one would have described a lot of our foreparents as suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, as they would have evaluated now. For them to be parenting, we know that a lot of harm has happened, and throughout history, and it continues, and we need to interrupt those patterns. I know many parents in the Caribbean who swear by the absolute right in being able to hit the children. As a matter of fact, I was on a radio program with one woman in the UK here who was sentenced to 3 months for repeatedly hitting her children, although she'd been warned. She felt so strongly she would prefer to go to jail, that she had the right, absolute, to hit her children. And I know for most Caribbean parents, they defend that right and think it's okay. And we need to really challenge it and keep looking at that. The research is very clear. Violence breeds violence. Other bits of research has shown that for parents who actually engage with the children more, the more we talk to them, they actually become smarter, because we help their cognitive system to develop more, because you're explaining, you're reasoning with them, they're having to take that on board. So there's actually real benefits in talking to children rather than hitting them. When we hit them, they actually think it's okay.
And also, as a mother of boys, allowing a boy child to express fear, to express confusion, to have the full gamut of emotions and be able to find safe space, if we can use that term, in the house that they're growing up in, to be able to process all of those emotions and be supported through all of those emotions, I think is important as well.
Yes,
I'm going to
go
ahead, Luke.
Before you do, I missed the opportunity when you asked the question a little bit back there as well, because I think one of the most damaging things that happens in terms of emotional development is that we also teach our boys, come on, big boys don't cry. We hear that almost everywhere. And then as they grow older as men, they're not able to express themselves well and show feelings, they get blamed for not having feelings, as it's put. So I think part of that whole emotional intelligence is about allowing our boys to cry. If they're hurt, they need to express that feeling, that emotion. So we need to interrupt the whole notion of that boys don't have feelings just like girls, that they can't express them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to take the opportunity to open up to the floor again to see if we have any questions this time. You can feel free to unmute yourselves and join the discussion.
Actually, I have a question, because as we have seen, I guess everybody kind of knows now that abuse is physical. Physical is always considered abuse. But I think what people are having a hard time conceptualizing is abuse really escalates to physical. It doesn't start there. It always starts with some precursor to abuse, especially in those long-term relationships, where most people think that everything is fine and dandy, but at some point the relationship breaks down and the cause is determined to be abuse. So what precursors in men then are cause for extreme concern? Because, and again, I preface it by saying that here in Barbados, we have an excellent domestic violence law, which outlines very clearly all of the other things that are considered abuse: financial abuse, emotional abuse, harassment, all of these things on top of physical violence. And yet we're seeing many women not come away with protection orders who fall under those other categories because, it somehow is being explained away as not being abusive. And so I guess my question is, what are the precursors in men, in abusers and perpetrators that make you worried about the possibility of abuse before we actually get to the physical violence?
Yeah, and I've met many survivors of domestic violence who, actually feel the emotional abuse is worse than the physical abuse. For most of the men that I've worked with, it's been the physical abuse they've used, but there's been a few with emotional abuse. And when I've dug into the reasons for those, it's usually about parenting again. And in one particular case, a man who had actually, I think probably the only man I counsel who would come to the Everyman Centre who had not used violence. As a matter of fact, he'd used violence on himself, as he described it. He would punch his legs or hit his head against a wall or something. As I explored his background, the way he got parented was to be sent to a room, and I think sometimes left there for too long, and he took out the anger on himself and so on. So when he was feeling emotionally distressed, with his partner, he couldn't hit her, he couldn't bring himself to hit her, but he would hurt himself. So I think emotional abuse is something that needs to be looked at, and I think the laws are looking at it more and more, and I think the progressive governments are including emotional abuses, something that's there, and also controlling behavior, has been welded into the domestic violence strategies now, that those needs to be looked at. Those lead up to domestic violence, and of course, verbal abuse. Most times, the men who will abuse will start to do that verbally before it becomes physical abuse. And it's well recorded really that, it's a strategy that even the military uses in some ways. I mean, some of the training manuals they use for men who will go into combat is to get a derogatory name for the enemy, the frogs or the crocs or the pigs or whatever they want to call them. And so you start to degrade the person in a way by just language. So that was part of my program, is to look at language and oppression, and definitely interrupting any kind of sexist language that's used, if men, for instance, you might come out and say, oh, the bitch, or, whatever. There's a word that would come. We need to look at that. And that needs to be interrupted and challenged, because we formulate those things in our head and our minds, and language is very crucial. And the use of language in terms of interrupting domestic violence. Yes, so those are issues we need to be looking at in terms of the whole domestic violence situation and how programs actually challenge men to stop their violence.
Thank you very
Okay, I hope
much.
that answers your question there, Robin.
Yep, it does. But I guess, well, I think Marcia will know where I'm going with this one, because we have a case even today where there has been physical violence. A client is trying to obtain a protection order, and even today, on the day that, you know, she's going to court, she receives 10 or so voice notes from her ex, you know, basically just degrading her, saying that he doesn't care, he really doesn't care what happens, you know, but she's ruining his life. And then we have, you know, an attorney and a law system that will look at that and say, well, you know, that's terrible, but that's not a cause for a protection order. That's just a man who is a little hot.
Wow, wow.
Long, long way
But you
to
see
go.
that this is where the whole system has to be challenged, you know, whether the legal system, you know, has to be challenged as well. You know, many judges come out with some outrageous sexist remarks in terms of when working with domestic violence and other issues. So we know that not only in the judicial system at the highest level, but also in the police force, as we've seen many cases where, you know, policemen are actually there's research showing that there's more domestic violence in the police force than in the population at large. So when you call in the police as your protector, you know, there's a lot lacking there. Yeah.
I saw Margaret with her hand up. Margaret, do you want to ask a question? Margaret Busby? If not, I have a comment in the chat.
Did you put up your hand? Sorry.
That's okay. I have a comment in the chat, which is a perfect segue into what I want to spend the last 15 minutes or so talking about. It says mental abuse is always downplayed, and then people wonder why battered women stay in abusive relationships. And I wanted to talk about why women stay and the state and the role of the state. I'm surprised, frankly, because I always feel like nowhere can be worse than Barbados when you talk about, you know, the challenges that you're having in the UK still. I know that you passed, when I say you, the UK passed the other day, the new piece of domestic violence legislation, which covers coercive control as a type of abuse, one of the first instances of that happening in the world. Talk to me a little bit about why women are staying, how men remain victims in some cases as they are, and the state and the role of the state.
Yeah, well, I think women stay for all kinds of reasons, you know, including economic ones, including loving a person, and so on. Protection, fear of leaving, you know, is also something that is there. And, you know, I need to say that the most dangerous time for a woman is when she decides to leave a relationship, because many women get seriously injured or killed at that point. So that needs to be really handled really well. So for any woman thinking about leaving a relationship, that needs to be in place. And I think, you know, this is why I feel it's so important that there be more projects for working with perpetrators. In my book, I mentioned the case of, you know, we're not just about trying to fix relationships and make them work. Sometimes we've got to say, you know, hey, you know, this is not going anywhere. You know, you need to move on, and we encourage and support those men to move on if it's not working out. One woman actually wrote into me saying thank you for the session that I'd facilitated with her and her husband, and getting him to realize that there's no way she could stay with him again. He attacked her while she had a small child in her hand, and she'd lost complete respect for him. She said there's no way she can stay in that. And, you know, we were able to work in a session together where he, you know, agrees, okay, you know, he's pulling back and so on, and she could feel safer. So I think facilitating the ending of a relationship is also important to make that woman feel safe. And, you know, and I can imagine in small communities, where, you know, you would be seeing that person, they're not too far away. You need to feel safe about being around them or being on the same island with them, as it turns out. So that work becomes even more crucial, that a woman can feel that she's really safe now with, you know, that man still being around somewhere if she's decided to end the relationship. And it's only by working with a perpetrator that that can really happen. He has to, one, you know, accept the responsibility for his violence, and also accept that a woman can change her mind and say, no, you know, it's ended. I want to move on. Mm-hmm. You have to give her that space, that right. She has that right absolutely to do that. Mm-hmm. Yes, so in the UK, although they've made that, you know, those advancements, and I think it's great, they still have not passed a law to outlaw violence to children. They still subscribe to the notion of reasonable chastisement. Now, the countries that have actually made it illegal to hit children, you know, those countries enjoy a lot more peaceful societies. There's less domestic violence. Many of the Scandinavian countries, there's less. The murder rates in those countries are way, way lower than most other countries. But more and more countries are beginning to move towards outlawing violence to children. Even in the UK, you know, Wales, I think, has outlawed, and Scotland. Scotland has outlawed violence to children, and I think Wales is pretty much there. But the UK, I don't know where. England, I don't know where they're at the moment. But that needs to happen. I think the first act for me against ending domestic violence is saying that violence to no one is acceptable, not children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Readdressing all of the power dynamics, really. As we bring it home, Luke, when we think about sustainable tomorrows, it means that small, open, and vulnerable economies like Barbados, and maybe not so much Guyana anymore because you guys have the oil now. But we have to think about how we're spending resources.
Whether we see the benefits is something else. But there you go.
We've got to think about how we're spending money. And I think in the Caribbean, we're spending way too much resource still when we think about, you know, women going to the hospital, the amount of women going through the court system, women who are coming to the police needing, you know, various types of services. In your research, have you ever come close to what the amount that we're spending on domestic violence looks like?
It's humongous. I mean, in the UK, it's something like, I think last year, something like 68 billion pounds as a result of domestic violence. Of course, a lot of countries don't have the resources to do the research to actually see how it's harming the economy. But it costs the economy a lot of money. When you think, you know, people got to go through the court system. If it's imprisonment for the man, you know, imprisonment, you know, it's expensive business. Never mind the emotional costs. So, you know, governments need to put attention to domestic violence. You know, if women are not happy in a population, things don't function, things don't work well. So we need to make sure that the spending is there, that, you know, the first thing I actually advocate for is where the safe spaces. So, you know, women must be able to have a refuge that they can escape to if they want to leave a violent relationship. And the men, the perpetrators, need to get attention to stop the violence. So both things need to be working. Now, I don't know if you've heard of it, the movement for, you know, there's an organization here, and I think in the US about wages for housework, which looks to value women's contribution to society as a whole. And of course, most of the caring that happens in our society is women are doing it and for free. And it's huge. You know, it's a discrimination and a exploitation of women in many ways. We see this pandemic has exposed not only that the incidence of domestic violence had gone up around the world because people were now forced to live together who weren't really getting along very well. So domestic violence actually increased. But some of the other research is showing how women are the ones who are really picking up the pieces around the pandemic, doing more caring, losing out on jobs, becoming economically worse off, and so on. So the whole system is geared to not catering to women's needs and women's protection, and more resources needs to be directed to women, in our societies. And so we want to see the way in which government actually value women's work. Um, I know in poor countries it doesn't happen, but in the UK and other developed countries, there's such a payment for carers. If somebody's caring for a mother or caring for some family member who needs care, they get the carer's allowance. Nowhere near enough what it should be given, but at least it's something. And it's a start. And yeah.
Absolutely. We have a question from Michelle. Michelle, go ahead with your question.
Hi, good night, everyone. I have two questions. The first question is, does anyone in the meeting able to speak to what resources or the amount of funds in Barbados that are allocated towards fighting domestic violence?
Well, I can tell you that the National Organization of Women gets a whopping 1,000 Barbados dollars yearly as a subvention.
Wow. Oh. Okay, second question. Thank you for that. Second question.
I hope that amount increases in the very near future.
We haven't gotten it for any of the COVID years. So
wow. No, that's not value. That's not value in Barbadian. I'm afraid that we need to be doing a lot better than that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And okay, my second question is in relation to protection orders. I've done some reading, and in some cases, the victim would have also filed criminal charges. And I wanted to touch on the point of the effect of also pressing criminal charges against the abuser, because even if you cannot obtain or you have difficulty obtaining a protection order, there are other avenues for harassment, such as malicious communications under the Computer Misuse Act, Section 14. And there's also, you can bring criminal charges for harassment under the requisite legislation. So I wanted to ask Mr. Daniels, in your experience, do you find it to be effective to do both together? Because sometimes the victim has difficulty proving that it was done or so on to me, and it's downplayed or whatever. You have to fight sometimes for these protection orders. Does it help if the victim also presses some criminal charges?
Yeah. In some cases it does, but clearly in many cases it doesn't work. It really depends on the man and the circumstances. In the UK, I know some judges have actually questioned whether it's working. The whole idea of the legalization really of domestic violence. I think we need to move our societies to a position where it's about finding solutions to this problem. And I think, so far as I can see, there's no real solutions being put forward in terms of ending domestic violence. The measures I feel that are necessary, for instance, in the UK, one is you got to protect children from violence. Both the Conservative and the Labour Prime Ministers in the past have assured parents that will never lose that right, to smack the children. So, that's where we stand in terms of the whole thing. Now, the whole problem about legalizing the whole process, one, it's very expensive. Two, sometimes, as has happened here in the UK, people have been campaigning for longer and harsher prison sentences for perpetrators. One judge has actually raised the issue that fewer and fewer women were coming forward with cases of domestic violence, to report it. And they felt that was a result, and this has happened since they've actually increased the fines or the penalties for domestic violence. So that says to me that the route to ending violence to women is not about legalizing an imprisonment and going down that whole court system, it doesn't work. You know, you put men in prison, they become more violent. You know, prison, you know, is known for making them become more violent. If there's no treatment when they're going to prison, I think it's a waste of resources. So I really think the whole answer towards this problem is, one, working with the perpetrators to change that they even don't get to the court. And this is what our project at the Everyman Centre was doing, in a sense, try to address, was to encourage men to come to the project before it got to the court. We wouldn't see them if they were charged or if they had to go to court. You know, because we didn't feel, you know, it was right for them to then at the court say, oh, I'm going to the Everyman Centre to get help. You know, we felt that if they had actually committed an offense, and I feel the law has got to be clear about it, you know, domestic violence is a crime and needs to be punished. And so I support that very much, because, you know, men need to get it, that if you hurt women, you know, it's illegal, you will face some kind of punishment. And I think that has to be said, and, you know, I do support that. But having said that, I think that the way forward and the way to end this whole situation is to try and transform society. We need to fix it so that men grow up knowing that, you know, it's not okay to hit women, and that takes more effort and so on, and more work, but more awareness raising, as it were. But we need to fix society, and the way is not through the legal process. You know, laws are there and they get broken. You know, I've known many cases of, you know, woman's got a protection order and she's ends up dead. You know, women have gone to the police and said 3-4 times, you know, this man is, I'm going to be killed, you know, and she's end up dead, you know, because the system and the laws will not fix this thing. You know, that man needed attention, need help to change. So, you know, I'm not so much in favor of the way the whole approach about illegal and imprisonment and so on is the way forward. And especially when the cases is not, you know, if a man does serious harm, and, you know, talking broken bones and that kind of stuff, you know, that needs to be in prison. You know, he needs, you know, people in society needs to be safe from him. But anybody who's in prison should also get counseling and get support, because they come out of their worst and they went in.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Thank you
I
so
have my
much.
deep criticism of the legal system. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We've been talking with Luke Daniels. He's a social activist, counselor, and consultant on domestic violence. Luke was born in Guyana, so he's a Caribbean man. He has resided in the UK since the 1970s. His pioneering work with perpetrators of domestic violence at the Everyman Centre in London received national recognition in 1992. Luke has written 2 books on the topic, Pulling the Punches, Defeating Domestic Violence, and Defeating Domestic Violence in the Americas, Men's Work. It has been my pleasure, Luke, to talk to you tonight, to bounce with you. Of course, we are working on a project that will bring Luke to Barbados to train some safe men. I'm very excited about that. We're beginning to put that together and start to think about what the funding for it looks like. But it definitely will be happening, because it is something that we need in Barbados as we think about gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. I want to thank all of you for having joined us this evening. I hope you all have a wonderful International Women's Day tomorrow. Thank you, and we will see you again soon.